Okay, more on California's advanced economy. A few questions that we'd like to answer during this is, how does California stack up economically with other states? And it is the biggest economy as far as the states go, the United States. And if it were its own country, it would be one of the top 10 economies of the world. It'd be roughly number 5. It dips it more or less. And would you guess that California's economy is relatively diverse? And like a lot of other things in California, that is true, that it's just as its natural environments and geography is diverse, so is its economy. All right, so let's talk about the change over time in California's economy that, like many other places in the 1800s, most people worked in primary industries such as agriculture and even extractive industries during the gold rush, mining for gold. And that, as we got into the Industrial Revolution, you had a big surge into secondary production. Into the mid-1900s, manufacturing was really big. During World War II and the Cold War, aerospace and other industries were a big part of California's industrial economy. And a more recent event is the evolution of the information technology, and that's from about the late 1990s to the present. This is the tertiary or higher parts of the economy, and this is really where there's been rapid growth in the economy of California. So Silicon Valley is the big one. A lot of the big names that we know, Facebook, Apple, Google, a lot of those are in the Bay Area of California. And when we talk about changes from different economic sectors, that's called restructuring. This is where there's a shift between, say, manufacturing and information technology. So just to give you an example, California had about 2 million manufacturing jobs in the 1980s, but only about half of that more recently. So there's been a big change from the manufacturing sector of the economy to more of the information or tertiary sector, service sector. So manufacturing has declined as a main sector of the economy, but it's still important. Computers, electronics, petroleum, chemical, food and beverages. This is an image showing the Tesla plant in the Bay Area, where you actually have some auto manufacturing happening here in the state. But again, it's a little bit more of a high-tech nature. Defense and aerospace industries, as mentioned, those were a big part of California's manufacturing. And in the 1900s, especially in Southern California, but you really had a decline in the 1990s because the end of the Cold War era. The Cold War between us and the Soviet Union was a big driver of aerospace industries, but as the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, that reduced the demand for these types of aerospace manufacturing outputs. Another aspect that is not in California but near California are maquiladoras. These are export-oriented factories in Mexico that produce items nearly exclusively to import into the United States. And many of those are concentrated near the US border. Trade is made easier through NAFTA, or what's now called the US, or going to be called the USMCA, which are free trade agreements with Mexico. And if you look at this figure where you have maquiladoras, most of them are up near the US, not all, but most of them, you have the greatest density near the US border, including near San Diego and Tijuana. And the reason why these are a big part, the reason why you have so much manufacturing happening in Mexico versus, say, California, is the difference in wages. That the idea is that goods get shipped down to Mexico. There are the raw materials. People in Mexico assemble products, and then those are shipped back to the United States. And where the economy in California has really grown, however, is high technology. So we have Silicon Valley, the Bay Area, semiconductors, some hardware, software especially internet-based things. In Orange County in Southern California, we have things like medical instruments, computer parts, and further south in San Diego County, that's a big hub for biotechnology and telecommunications. So biotechnology, that's a big part of the economy in the San Diego area. Entertainment is a significant part of the economy, and especially, you know, think of Hollywood and all of the associated industries in Southern California had high growth from the 1990s. More recently, we've been competing more with other states who offer more tax incentives for producing television shows and other things, but it's still a important part of the economy, and it helped the growth of the entertainment industry helped to offset job losses from the defense and aerospace that declined in the 1990s in Southern California. And Silicon Valley, it led the California out of the recession of the 1990s. And there's a few geographic qualities about California that really helped. What's called a regional advantage, that there are some geographic aspects to Silicon Valley of having a lot of combinations of educational facilities like Stanford University and other companies in the same proximity. And there is a concept called social capital, where there is a kind of a culture in Silicon Valley of firms working with each other to solve problems. So by collaborating with each other and the spirit of collaboration, it's helped to fuel a lot of the success. So, you know, the big companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, these are all examples of Silicon Valley companies. Another example of growth has been in the San Gabriel Valley in Southern California. And if you recall, when we've talked about the cultural aspects of California, that this is where we have high concentrations of people of Asian background. In fact, there's more people of Chinese background in San Gabriel Valley than any part of California. And some, especially more recent immigrants, may have, you know, social and economic ties to China, and that has helped to increase the amount of economic activity, especially that's directed overseas. In fact, there's a concept in the book describes the golden triangle. And the idea is that in the Bay Area, this is where computer firms design and produce microprocessors and software. Those are then transmitted electronically or physically to overseas to Asia, especially Taiwan off the coast of China, where there's a lot of and China itself, where there's a lot of manufacturing that's done. And then goods are sent back to Southern California to be distributed, shipped out, or even some final assembly, so that there's this overseas relationship between East Asia and California, especially in things like the computer manufacturing industry. Tourism is another important part of California's economy. California is the top state for tourism, with destinations like San Francisco, things in Southern California like Disneyland, and so on. Most of the tourists come from Mexico, which kind of makes sense by proximity, that Mexico is really close to California, and also Canadians as well, from not quite as close, but not too far. The United Kingdom, Japan, and so on. But most of the big draw for tourists from, well, not really overseas, but from another country is Mexico. And California is also the top state for US exports. And it kind of makes sense geographically because of our situation on the Pacific Rim, that because of our proximity over the ocean to East Asia, that is a real big driver in overseas trade. So California accounts for about 15% of US overseas sales of goods. And one part of that is a concept called a break of bulk point. These are essentially shipping terminals where goods are transferred between, especially containerized shipping. These are big box containers that are unloaded from ships. Those can be put on trains and trucks and other modes of transportation. We have some big ones here, the Port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach. Those are the top 2 container ports of the US, especially because of the trade from East Asia. There's what's called a GIT, or Joint Intermodal Terminal, that connects rail lines with the Port of Oakland, and the Alameda Corridor that connects rail with the Los Angeles and Long Beach ports. So that the interconnection between shipping and rail lines is an important part of the trade in California. Real estate is another important part of the economy. We had a big real estate boom from the 1990s up until the Great Recession in like the mid 2000s. But then it really it's kind of come back since then as well. However, there's unequal distribution of the rise of the real estate economy, that you have booms in areas like San Francisco, Los Angeles, where prices really have skyrocketed. And that's also affected the growth of bedroom communities in outside of San Francisco and Los Angeles. So for example, in the Central Valley, especially in Modesto, Los Banos, you had a kind of outgrowth because of the high prices of high cost of living in the Bay Area. And the same thing with what's called the Inland Empire of Southern California, that you had an expansion of housing as people kind of had to move inland to look for affordable housing.